as a town meeting member, and as I run into people, as everybody is talking about in town, the cost is exploding people's heads. That's not what we're here to talk about tonight, but we are here to talk about the sustainability features, just so people can really understand that and put that into perspective. Okay. Just to remind everybody, LexCAN is a Lexington Climate Action. Our vision is that we are working on climate solutions, climate justice, and a sustainable future. And this definitely falls into our educate, advocate, collaborate tagline, which is something we work to do every day. So why are we discussing this topic? Climate change is here. We all know it. We see it. It's in the news every day. I get the alert I got on my phone today is that methane is being, the levels of methane are out of control, are spiking in ways that nobody expected. And we don't know what that means. And unfortunately, we're going to find out. The answer to it, as Bill McKibben likes to say, is stop burning stuff. So that's one of the main things we want to do at the high school, and we are doing in Lexington, and we've worked on it. Sustainability is so important. It means that the school will be ever present as long as it's still standing, and it's still going to be clean and healthy, and we'll be working with the environment and not against it. Resiliency is another important piece of this project, in that it could end up being a place we lose power for 5 days. We need the place that has backup batteries and can get the sun, even though we've lost electricity, it still can get sun. So there are a lot of reasons to have a resilient building in town, but it also means kids can go back to school. It also means if we have 110-degree days, they can still learn. And achieving our climate goals is a very important part of this, because we have to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, which is in only 5.5 years. So tonight we'll be quickly discussing what it means to build sustainably, the features and advantages of it, the economics of it, and resiliency, which I just discussed. We are not discussing the 6 design options that exist right now. We are not talking about those, and we're not going to talk about costs other than the economics of our sustainability features. That those discussions are happening. People. So we're going to ask people to stay muted. This will be recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. We're going to have a Q&A afterwards. We'd like people to put their questions in the chat, and we will ask them of Mark and Cindy. And we're going to keep our questions to the topic of sustainability, so we won't entertain any of those other issues. We hope to end at 8. I know some people have places to be at 9 o'clock, and so we'll go to 8:30 if there are enough questions, but otherwise we'll end at 8. Just a few events that are coming up. Next Tuesday is the Farmers Market Sustainability Day. LexCAN will be there, as will lots of other people. There's this passport to a healthy planet that will be given out to all the kids, and they go around and they ask some questions. They get a star that they visited LexCAN or Maggie Peered. Sustainable Middlesex, which is a little bit of an offshoot of LexCAN, is doing an information session on the recyclable programs, because a lot of communities don't use it. We do through Lex Zero Waste. So if you want to know about that, we'll get it up on our website. And then on September 18th, we are co-sponsoring with Lex Farm and the library the movie Common Ground, which is about our soil. And that will be outdoors at Lex Farm. I want to remind everybody, there's still room in the composting program. If you're not already in the composting program, please sign up. Let's fill all those spaces. Pay attention to advocacy. As If you don't know, we did not get a climate bill out of the last session, but they are hoping to have a new formal session and we will be speaking to Senator Barrett next week. So stay tuned. This will be important. We'll all have to get active and then join us. LexCAN can always use more help in order to reach our vision and mission. So our speakers tonight are Cindy Ahrens and Mark Sandine. Cindy is the current chair of the Sustainable Lexington Committee. She's co-chair of the LPS Green Teams and co-founder of Lexington Clean Heat. Mark Sandine is a current select board member. He's the original chair. And creator of the Sustainable Lexington Committee, and so much more that I just couldn't list it all there. So Mark and Cindy are going to be speaking to us, and we will have Cindy.
Yes, thank you,
Cindy.
Thank you very, very much. Can you all hear me okay? Good. All right, I'm getting my slides up. Thank you to LexCAN, as always, trying to educate our community about what's going on here, about what's going on with sustainability, and how we can move forward. So Ricky sort of posed this question to Mark and I about the presentation tonight, and what does it mean to build sustainably? All right, so what I'm not going to do tonight is tell you there's an assumption here. You know that Lexington has a climate action and resilience plan. If you don't know about it, go and read about it. If you want to talk offline about it, I am very, very happy to do that. I'm sure Mark would be too, and Maggie Peart, our wonderful sustainability and resilience officer here in Lexington. So what's building sustainably? Well, of course, no greenhouse gas emissions, obvious. But there's also other sustainable pieces, like is how do you make sure the cost is sustainable? Long-term costs are sustainable. How do you make sure that we sustain the health of the occupants of those buildings? And as Ricky very, very well mentioned earlier, resilience of the building, resilience of the people in the building, all very, very important. So what I'm not going to do, another thing, Ricky called out a number of things. What I'm also not going to do is cover every possible way that you could consider how to make a building or its surroundings sustainable, right? I'm not going to talk about trees, so important, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. We are covering some very, very key items that have come up and will continue to come up in the design for the LHS project. So just to give you a little bit of background, if you don't already know, we have some state policies, state laws that have been passed that are in effect here in Lexington, an updated stretch code, a specialized code, and also a town bylaw. We are one of 10 communities. I'm not sure who the 10th is yet. Nine communities so far, part of the Massachusetts Municipal Fossil Fuel Free Building Program. So those went into effect either last year or this year, and they are sort of frame what we are required to do to make really, really great buildings in Lexington. But what's even, I would argue, more important is a policy that has been in effect here in Lexington, passed by adopted by the Select Board and the School Committee in 2018, updated just last year in 2023. It's technically the Integrated Building Design and Construction Policy. What we know now is it's not the best for saying really fast a lot of times. So a lot of people will call it the Integrated Building Policy or the Integrated Design Policy. When you start getting really involved in what's happening with the high school, you'll see that our designer, SMMA, calls it IDP in a lot of places, so that's why I'm calling it out. Please don't try and read the wonky spreadsheet that I have over on the side there. That's just trying to show you that's one of the pieces of the IDP, the Integrated Design and Construction, Building Design and Construction Policy, the way we track many, many things that are really important. This applies to public buildings in the town, right? Schools, public office buildings. And in many ways, this policy really was ahead of its time because it had required things that weren't at the time required by the state, and now the state is kind of catching up. So if you look at improved energy efficiency and pushing towards all electric, pushing towards solar energy generation on site, when this policy went into place, that wasn't part of any state building requirements, and now it is. This policy, though, is really, really good because it's still a little bit ahead of its time, because we are looking at ways to use energy storage through batteries to offset peak demand energy charges, to assist with backup power. So there are things that are still not quite, in state policy that are really, really important, and is going to generate excellent outcomes. Red list, we don't want toxic materials in our buildings, for our students, for our staff, for anybody, and increased ventilation and air filtration, right? All of those things, really, really good things. But one last thing I actually didn't talk about, the first point there, is it also requires a life cycle cost analysis. And it's actually an iterative life cycle cost analysis, because as you can imagine, as we're looking at possible designs and making decisions going forward, we've got to look at all of those things together and iterate over and over, so we're making the best choices, so that we're making from a cost perspective, from a health perspective, from a climate and emissions perspective. So it's a really, really important part. And if you've been involved in any of the meetings so far in public events about the school building committee meetings, some of that is starting, but it's not done yet. We're not going to get, and even what you'll see, a lot of this that Mark is going to be talking about later, these are still ongoing, right? We've got to look at the numbers and sort of figure out what's the right sort of direction to turn, and then redo the numbers and make sure that we're getting the best possible outcome for our staff, for our students, for our community. So again, really quick, down at the bottom here, there's what helps us, and what's an awesome thing, is there's lots of new incentives that will help reduce the upfront costs. So you'll hear about them. What I tried to do here is put all the different terms. Sometimes they're called utility incentives, sometimes they're called mass save, sometimes they're called Eversource. If you hear about federal incentives, sometimes they're called IRA, because they're a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, but they're also called ITCs, which are investment tax credits. Great stuff that's really going to make this worth our while and make our budget sustainable as well. And then there's lots of things that are going to, when you bring them all together, they're going to reduce operating costs. We're going to generate our own electricity. You can't generate your own. We're not going to generate our own fossil fuels here. We can generate our own electricity, avoid peak demand energy charges, protect us from energy spikes. And then on top of that, there are also programs that will pay us for generating heat and power through the systems that we're going to be designing here. So really, really great benefits. Reduce costs, right? Well, what else? Even probably more importantly, right? Health, reduce allergens, reduce toxins, reduce pollution. It makes for fewer sick days, better productivity, better teacher retention, better learning. These are all things that are key. Yet we know there's lots of talk about our educational program and how we need to how we have some gaps, right? And that's why we're talking about this project as a whole, right? We need some more space in the classrooms. We need lots and lots of things. We need this as well for our students and our staff. And then again, as Ricky mentioned, all sorts of benefits of resiliency in this building. Backup power, actually creating a really good envelope. You might hear the word envelope being talked about a lot. That's about how well insulated, how good that building is, that even if you have power outages, it's at nighttime and something happened with the backup diesel generator, that building will be still a safe place, will keep thermal comfort for whoever's inside it. So lots of good reasons to that come out of the resiliency of the that we're looking for in this project. Oh, and yes, and by the way, we will seriously reduce our emissions. So it's like, yeah, it's the beginning, and there's all these other things. We're going to do that too. So you are going to hear some of the things that I talked about right now repeated as Mark continues on, but it's really important stuff. I think sometimes you want things repeated so that they'll stick with you and you remember them. Hopefully I didn't take too much time.
Nope, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Cindy. That was great. And yes, we will talk about a couple of these things again, but I just wanted to get to my pointer in the right place so I can move things forward. Okay, here we go. So what we wanted to talk about today is what are our goals? And when people, there's sort of a natural reaction when you hear somebody saying all these wonderful things that Cindy just said. We have resilience, we have solar energy, we have energy storage. People tend to ask, what's this going to cost us? So the select board, the school committee, the school building committee have established these goals. We want to have an all-electric HVAC system with domestic hot water. We want to have incredible, excellent energy efficiency. That's a target called 25 EUI, 25,000 BTUs per square foot. We're asking to maximize on-site renewable energy production with the goal of having net zero energy design. And we also want to use solar and energy storage to maximize our operational savings. And as Cindy was just saying, also achieve the highest performance indoor air quality standards and compliance with all the other things that the integrated building design and construction policy calls for. But back to this question, how much is it going to cost me? And what we're going to talk about today is that the Lexington High School design to these standards will have a lower upfront cost and a lower total life cycle cost than a conventionally designed Lexington High School. And how is that possible, and how can we know that's going to be possible? So for that, I just wanted to take you back in time a little bit and talk about Lexington's experience designing 2 net zero schools that we've already done using the integrated building design and construction policy. And so about 8 years ago, we asked ourselves, is it possible to design healthy, resilient, all-electric schools with the highest standards for indoor air quality and energy efficiency, and a building that generates more energy on site than it uses, and to do all of that with a lower total life cycle cost than a traditional design? And the answer is yes. What you're looking at here is Hastings School. It's a 110,000 square foot net zero building for 645 students that's operating and fully occupied today. And the foundational critical success factor in this decision-making process is changing the way you think about things, changing from the traditional focus on upfront costs and payback times, which is the way most people tend to think about these things, but changing to the way we actually pay for our buildings. So let me ask you a question. How many folks listening today paid for your home with cash up front? Well, in Lexington, we finance our buildings with 30-year bonds. We don't pay for the buildings up front. The building's total cost to the town is its cash flow. And that cash flow is a combination of the operating and maintenance costs plus the debt service on the bond. And the life cycle cost analysis that we want to do is focused on whether those lower operating and maintenance costs of a net zero design can offset the increased debt service that it costs to put these things in place. And our target is to be cash flow positive on the first day the students move in. So how did this journey go? So back when we first started designing Hastings School, we said, is it possible to design a net zero school? There were no net zero schools in all of Massachusetts. And the conventional wisdom was that it would be impossible to design a 3-story school building with a gymnasium and a cafeteria in Massachusetts to net zero standards. So to start, we asked, would it be possible to improve the building's overall energy efficiency? And we set a target of 30% compared to conventional code at the time. And surprisingly, the design team came back with a highly cost-effective design that reduced energy use by 50% while still achieving our highest standards for indoor air quality. So the conventional design would have filled the roof with HVAC equipment, and that would have eliminated the possibility of doing solar. So we asked, could we use ground source heat pumps, and would they free up the roof for solar? And the answer was yes, but it would increase the cost of the building. And even with solar covering the entire roof, there still wouldn't be enough power to go net zero. So we asked, what about the parking lots? Could we put solar canopies in our parking lots to make up the difference? And the answer again came back, yes. The solar canopies at Hastings produce roughly 2/3 of all of the building's energy usage, and the rooftop solar covers the rest. So another success factor in this process is using a scenario-based structure to look at all the key assumptions from a low, medium, and high estimate, from 5% probability at the low end to 95% probability at the high end. You prepare a range of estimates, whether it's for interest costs, whether it's for the cost of the equipment, whether it's energy trends, and what are the ranges that are possible for the incentives. And so we do this, as Cindy mentioned, in an integrated fashion, looking at the synergistic benefits of all these things together. Conventional modeling, when we looked at each one of these things in isolation, should we do solar? Should we go with ground source heat pumps? Should we invest in a highly energy efficient envelope? Those, if we did those decisions in a traditional siloed energy decision-making process, we would have decided against each one of those options, and we would have had a conventional Hastings school. But what we saw was that a larger solar array allows for a smaller energy storage system to more effectively lower the cost of energy. And that lower cost of energy made the savings for the heat pump look even more attractive, which also increased the value of the heat pump, and the larger solar array also increased the value of the heat pump incentives from the state. And so the result is this slide, which summarizes this whole integrated scenario-based financial analysis. And what it shows is that the incremental debt service required to fund the ground source heat pumps in 3 scenarios, from the number of wells to the cost per foot of the wells to the interest rate of those on that debt service. And across the top, it shows the potential benefits based on the size of the solar we could install, the size of the storage we can install, the value of energy and incentives and maintenance. And the amazing thing that we found from this analysis is that we took the worst possible case from a cost perspective and said, what if the ground source heat pumps cost the absolute most they could possibly cost, and the interest rates were as high as they could possibly cost? And we compared it to the absolute worst case for the benefits. And what we found was that in that case, where the worst happened to both scenarios, we had the highest cost ground source heat pumps and the lowest cost benefits, we still came out ahead. And so it became a no-brainer to move forward. And as a result, the interesting thing is that we found that well, let me just say, our financial analysis staff is highly conservative when setting these scenario assumptions. And so we found that we actually delivered the ground source heat pumps at the low end of the cost, with fewer wells and a lower cost per foot, and at lower interest rates than we expected. And we found that the benefits of the solar and the storage and the energy savings all came in at the top end of the range. So what we found was that Hastings School's operating costs came in way higher than what we were expecting. And as Cindy was mentioning, one of the things that a lot of folks don't focus on is that the integrated building design and construction policy's primary goal, the number one thing that we say we want to do with the integrated building design and construction policy, is enhance the health of our staff and our teachers. And one of the best ways to do that is by having incredibly excellent high standards for indoor air quality. And what you find is that there are study after study that shows that this clean and healthy air and natural sunlight, good thermal comfort, and moisture control results in fewer sick days, heightened student participation, and you get better test scores. So what you're starting to see is that this is becoming the standard in the way that people build buildings. And hang on. Okay, my pointer isn't on the right screen. And these cognitive benefits are highly tied to the level of ventilation in the building. And the Lexington Board of Health recommends a CO2 level of 600 parts per million. We're discussing this with the school building committee right now. And this is consistent with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health guidelines for students as well. What they're saying is you get significantly higher cognitive performance, and this is a study from the Harvard School of Public Health, on basic activities, on informational usage, on strategy. But for me, one of the most amazing things is that you see twice the performance in a crisis for staff than you do when you have high CO2 levels. So there's significant benefits here, not just from a health perspective, not just from a cognitive performance perspective, but also from a staff productivity perspective. And one of the things we're going to think about is that the cost of energy in running the school is like $1.5 million a year, but we spend $55 million a year on staff and teachers at the school. And so a small productivity increase of, say, 5% can provide twice or three times the energy cost benefits that we're going to be talking about later. So when you optimize for health, you're also optimizing for the bottom line of how we spend the majority of our money in the schools. And so this is what, this financial analysis, as I've said, all that financial analysis, those charts are only looking at hard measurable energy related numbers, but it's Lexington's focus on health that drives the true return on investment of what we're seeing. And that's the outcomes we want to desire. So the point of all this, talking about what we did in the past, is this is a highly repeatable process. We use this to design another net zero preschool building, the Lexington Children's Place, as well as the Lexington Fire and Police Headquarters. And so now what I would like to do is talk about solar. There's a lot of folks who think if you put all the solar you need on the campus, that means that your energy bills will go to zero. But the facts are that the way that Lexington pays for its electricity is we have a usage charge, which is the electrons coming out of the solar panels, but we also have a peak demand charge. And for those of you who don't live in the energy world, a peak demand charge is essentially the utility looks at your electricity usage over the entire billing cycle of a month on 5-minute intervals and says, what is the highest 15-minute period that you used energy for in that 15-minute period? And so then they charge you based on the most, it's sort of like a size of the pipe, if you want to think about it in terms of getting water into your house. They charge you for how big a pipe they need to put into the facility. And so the problem with just putting solar energy on the site without energy storage is that the solar does not really reduce any of the peak demand charges because excuse me, as you can see here, this is an actual output from the current Lexington High School. And what you're seeing in blue is the energy demand from the building, and in yellow, the solar power generated from the rooftops. And what you can see here is that we turn our buildings on before the sun comes up. And so we get high peak demand charges way before the solar turns on. And if you look over to the right of the screen there, you can see that we often have cloudy days. And so when you have a cloudy day, even if the building's turning on at the same time as the solar, you won't get much reduction in peak demand. And so what we want to do then is we want to take a look at what this means for Lexington High School. And what you're looking at the top of the screen here, this is a model. This is a 15-minute model of what Lexington High School, the new Lexington High School, the 475,000 square foot Lexington High School would look like with a net zero solar energy system installed on site. And the blue things that you're seeing here, these big blue things, are what Eversource sees on their meter. And so what you're seeing here is what I told you before is we turn our buildings on before the sun comes up. So you see a big peak demand here, and then you see a bigger peak demand over here. But more importantly, on sort of like weekend days, what you're looking at here is the building isn't on at all, but the solar is cranking hard. And so Eversource sees this massive export of power from the solar array. They don't like that. They don't like the high thing either. What we're getting charged for is these peak demand peaks. So even if you had just 15 minutes at this level, you'd get charged for 1.5 megawatts of peak demand. And so the idea is, how do we minimize this while still also getting the solar energy system connected? Now, Eversource fought us very hard on Hastings, and at the end of the day, would only allow us to install slightly less than 1 megawatt of export power. And so what we're seeing here is if we try to put the size of the system in place that we need in order to have a net zero school, Eversource will not allow us to connect it unless we use energy storage. And so what you're seeing here is that the energy storage is storing power while the solar is high in the battery so that you don't export. You see this sort of flat blue all the way across. You never export more than 500 kilowatts of power. And you never import more than about 400 kilowatts of power in this particular arrangement that we're simulating here. And so the idea is that the energy storage not only is going to save you money, but it's going to fundamentally enable the net zero solar to go into place. If we don't have energy storage, we will have maybe a third of the solar power that will be allowed to be interconnected. Okay, so what does this mean in dollars and cents? So Lexington High School, if we did not have any solar whatsoever, we just put in a ground source heat pump and said we're going to have buy all of our electricity from Eversource, we'd be using 3.5 million kilowatt hours of annual electricity, and we'd be paying about $600,000 in annual usage charges, and we'd be paying about $575,000 in peak demand. Again, it's about 50%. If we put in solar with a significant energy storage system, we're going to generate that 3.5 million kilowatt hours of solar, but we're also going to reduce our peak demand by 1.1 megawatts, 1,150 kilowatts of peak demand reduction. So we will get that $600,000 in usage savings. We'll also earn some renewable energy certificate revenue, but the energy storage system can't bring the energy storage down to zero. So we don't quite deliver. So here you see we have peak demand charges of 575. We can reduce those by 425 with an optimal energy storage system. The interesting thing is that Eversource, for their system-wide grid, needs peak demand reduction for themselves. And they will pay us to discharge our battery into the grid. It turns out mostly in the summertime. They have like 60 days in the summertime where they'd like us to discharge at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. in the afternoon when it's really high peak demand and everybody's air conditioners are cranking. It becomes very inexpensive for them to pay us this money rather than firing up new generators and transmission lines. So they'll pay us a bunch of money, and we actually make more money on the energy storage than we would have paid in peak demand charges. And finally, as Cindy mentioned before, there's this alternative portfolio standard that the state gives us revenue if we have a ground source heat pump that's powered by solar energy. And you can earn $337,000. The bottom line here is that by putting a solar and energy storage system together, in the first year of operation, we'll have about $1.7 million of positive cash flow. And also, those are the hard energy numbers. And to Cindy's point, we also have the health benefits of reducing our climate emissions of about $210,000. But just in hard energy numbers, that $1.7 million in year one positive cash flow will translate into $55 million of positive cash flow over 30 years. And this is what our finance folks will be seeing from their perspective. What they're going to be seeing is this $1.7 million worth of revenue coming in the first year, and they're going to be seeing about $750,000 of debt service and maintenance cost in the first year. So we essentially come out of the year with slightly less than $1 million in positive cash flow. And as you can see, the bond goes to zero over 30 years. Meanwhile, the energy costs in the marketplace are rising. And so we see an accelerating trend in the value of the solar and energy storage system. And so one of the key things people are worried about in the energy world these days, as we all found out when Putin invaded Ukraine, we saw 2x or 3x price spikes in terms of energy, and that cratered a lot of people's budgets. But if we if we install solar and energy storage on the system day one with enough to cover our entire school's needs, it doesn't matter what external events happen in the rest of the world, what happens with energy prices. I had somebody ask me the other day, they said, what if electricity prices double? Why would we want to do this if electricity prices double? And the answer is because we will be paying exactly the same amount for our energy, which is essentially the price of this debt service, this bond. We've locked in, we've hedged for the next 30 years. We know exactly how much it's going to cost us to have our energy, and it's covered in our debt service. It's a really nice thing from a financial perspective. So the next thing that people want to find out about is what about heating systems? Should we use a conventional boiler? Well, we can't in Lexington because we passed the specialized energy code, and the integrated building design and construction policy calls for all electric construction as well. That's what we've been doing for the past 6 or 8 years. But let's take a look at it from a pure economic perspective. And one of the most amazing things that's happened in this marketplace is that the federal government and the state government and our utilities have all decided that it's very beneficial for reaching their climate goals to provide some incentives for ground source heat pumps. And so what you're going to see here, ASHP stands for air source heat pumps, GSHP stands for ground source heat pumps. The net here is that with the incentives that are available, we're going to find that a ground source heat pump has $14.8 million lower upfront cost after incentives than an air source heat pump. And it also has $10.8 million lower upfront cost than if we had decided to install a conventional fossil fuel HVAC system. So ground source heat pump is the lowest cost, upfront cost way to heat our buildings today. And what you're seeing here, these are numbers from a recent presentation that SMMA made to the school building committee, saying that they're estimating that a HVAC system built around air source heat pumps would cost $65 million for the school, and one with ground source heat pumps would cost $81 million. And they've suggested that the energy efficiency targets that we've set for ourselves would cost about $7 million. What they have told us is that they don't think they can make the 25 EUI target with air source heat pumps, but they feel fairly confident that they can with ground source heat pumps. And Mass Save gives you $1.6 million in incentives if you can bring the building in under 25 EUI. And Mass Save is also providing $4,500 per ton of ground source heat pump incentives. And for this size ground source heat pump that SMMA is suggesting we would need, we would be getting about $4.8 million in incentives. And so the interesting, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, and by the way, none of these incentives are available for air source heat pumps. The Inflation Reduction Act also says that we will get a 30% credit on the total cost of the HVAC system was $81 million. So if you multiply 81 by 0.3, you get $24.3 million. And so the net of this is if you have a total cost of doing a ground source heat pump of $88 million, you subtract these numbers from that, you end up at a total cost of $57 million, whereas the air source heat pump would cost $72 million. So we have 14 million, almost $15 million of savings. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. After incentives. But the interesting thing is if you're saving money up front, and remember, we don't buy our buildings with cash, we buy our buildings with bonds. So that reduces the value of the bond that we have to take out by $15 million. And so if you look at that cost over 30 years, that $15 million translates into $22 million of debt service. And by the way, of course, the reason everybody's asking us to do ground source heat pumps is because there's substantial electricity savings by moving to a ground source heat pump as opposed to an air source heat pump. And that translates into savings. So if we put our 3 megawatt solar array up, it would not have enough power to provide all the power for the air source heat pumps. And we'd have to buy $5 million worth of electricity from Eversource if we went with an air source heat pump. So that's a benefit for the ground source heat pump. We wouldn't have to buy this $5 million. That's $27 million in total life cycle cost savings, mainly enabled by the fact that we have energy storage, which allows that net zero solar to be put in place. And then finally, as Cindy mentioned earlier, the MSBA Green Schools program has additional funding of 3% for specialized code compliance, which obviously we're doing here in Lexington, and 1% additional for indoor air quality. And for the current values of what we're looking at for the high school of just around $650 million, that works out to $25.9 million total of MSBA Green Schools potential. And so at the end of the day, what that translates into is the healthiest LHS at the lowest cost. These higher design standards for all electric healthy buildings that give us incredible indoor air quality, exceptional resilience, and better cognitive performance for our students can deliver over $100 million in lower total life cycle cost ownership for our high school. And that's the story.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Cindy. That was excellent. Lot of information there, and people can certainly, as you know, we're recording this. We'll put it up, and if you want to go through it again a little bit more slowly and try to understand it better, feel free. But let's get to questions, Mark and Cindy. You put a lot of information out there.
I know, and I know I want to put one more piece of information out there. Sorry, because it reminded me, you know, what Mark summarized that, you know, when he's looking at those comparisons, there's an integrated design process going on, right? SMMA, the design group, they're going to be able to refine that, and they've said that in our focus groups. They've said that, so they're going to be able to refine that. So they're going to get more. They're going to be able to. I think they're being a little conservative right now. Like they need to really understand how much ground source, how many wells do we need, all of those things. So there's still a lot of potential to even have much smaller systems, maybe, more solar on the roof, all of those kinds of things. So it's really, really important that we're looking at it now, it's leading us in a certain direction, and then we can refine that and really maximize the savings, maximize the health and beneficial outcomes.
Thank you. And thank you to Mark and Cindy for constantly keeping their eye on this bouncing ball as things are changing or decisions get found out. They are on it. And I encourage everybody who has come tonight or tell your friends. Olga, put your question in the chat, and if it's, we'll unmute you if it's too complicated to write out the question. To go to meetings, because this is not something you should decide when the debt exclusion comes before you. This is something you should educate yourselves on. And that's what I'm telling people when I run into people and they say, what's going on with the high school? I say, go to meetings, learn about it, participate. It's a big project for the town. We have some members of the SBC, which is this school building committee here. I think that's what SBC stands for. And I'm thankful for that and for all the time that everybody's putting into this project. Okay, so somebody, well, I'll start with the questions that have come through so far. How many cloudy days in a row will planned battery capacity cover? And if it's too soon to know, but best guess.
So how many days will it cover? So the basic idea here is that what we're doing, the modeling is based on the current building use and the current known weather performance for that. And so what ends up happening is you design the system so that it can cover the entire 30 days. So you have to size the system to be big enough so that you don't let an exceedance happen in those 30 days. And so essentially what you do is you design with a little bit of margin. So essentially, if designed well, it takes into account the sort of normal everyday cloudiness that you would see in a typical year. So you don't have to worry about cloudy days. It's designed for Lexington's weather.
Okay, next question. Does this assume purchasing solar, not leasing? I believe I know
Yes.
the answer, but yes, purchasing. I think we have stopped leasing for a while now.
Right.
Is that true? Yes.
We
Okay.
stopped after the Inflation Reduction Act made tax credits to be direct payable to municipalities. So in the past, what ended up happening was those tax credits, a town couldn't grab a hold of them. And so you had to go to a third party. It's a complicated process, and they need to get money from hedge funds on Wall Street, and you need to pay them their interest rates. So it's a much cleaner deal and a much more advantageous financial deal when we can just get that money directly without having to go through a middleman.
And I'll just throw a plug in for voting, since the Inflation Reduction Act is a federal program.
Could I just make a comment about that, Ricky?
Sure.
So lots of people ask about the Inflation Reduction Act in relation to voting. And so the Inflation Reduction Act was an act that was passed by the House. It was passed by the Senate. It was signed by the president. And so in order for the Inflation Reduction Act to change, you would need the House and the Senate and the president to all want to make that change. The interesting thing about the Inflation Reduction Act, here's the amazing thing. We're sitting here looking at how much money is coming to Massachusetts with the Inflation Reduction Act. But it turns out that 80% of the Inflation Reduction Act money goes to non-blue states. 20% of the entire Inflation Reduction Act is going to the state of Texas. And there's been 18 Republican congressmen who've written to the Speaker of the House saying, don't touch this Inflation Reduction Act. So I think I don't think we need to worry a lot. I mean, anything is possible, but I don't think we need to worry a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act going away tomorrow.
Good. So I'm going to read Todd's question. One slide refer to 25 kBTU. Is this a typo? Shouldn't it be 25 BTUs per square foot?
No, it is 25,000 BTUs per square foot is what it's an annual number. So I can understand Todd's question, thinking about it from a capacity perspective. This is actually the amount of energy used in that square foot over the entire year of the building's operation.
Right. It's not a BTUs per hour.
It's not an instantaneous thing.
It's a BTUs per year.
Yes.
Per square foot.
Yes, I should have put that in there for those of you
who reads the parts that say it's KTBU. Okay, currently the state does offer off-peak rates, so I would think they are likely within it. Oh, they don't.
Yeah,
Todd, they don't. You say it says does. Don't offer off-peak rates. True. Though I would think they are likely within a decade. Does anything in the proposed design anticipate off-peak rates?
So the energy storage system is basically a lot of metal that changes how it behaves based on the software that programs it. So if a tariff changes, then you would just modify your software to optimize for that new tariff. It's the wonderful thing about the energy storage system, and I don't want to waste a bunch of people's time on this, but it's the Swiss Army knife of energy. You can have it do basically anything. If you want reactive power, you can have reactive power. If you want peak demand savings, you can have peak demand savings. If you want to do frequency regulation, you can do anything people like Cindy, who is a software programmer, can think of, and you can make this thing do.
Yeah, Todd, I see your question on gas powered backup, and I did hear Mark also mention having a diesel, and I think all of our new buildings also have a diesel powered backup. No?
Fire and police are required by law to have diesel. Schools are not. But the interesting thing is that the incentives that we're looking at from Eversource, they will not allow a gas line to the school even for backup generators. So we will have a diesel backup, even though it's not required by state law or EPA law or whatever, but there will be a fossil fuel backup. That's an exception to the town's fossil fuel free bylaw. The intent, however, is that the energy storage system is going to have enough capacity that after it's done all this other wonderful stuff for us and generating $1 million a year for us, it's going to have enough backup capacity if we've designed it correctly that essentially that diesel generator never have to turn on unless we get like multiple days.
It's a backup to the backup.
Yes.
Right.
They call it N+1, right? A sort of resilience strategy.
I'm going to just take a very quick stab at this question about the cash flow return question. That all just gets built into our debt. You know, we have to pay for the building. There is nothing about this building that's going to make it free. So it's still going to cost a fair amount of money. What we're doing is reducing the costs and reducing the debt that we're going to have to take out. And what those numbers end up being, as Cindy talked about, and correct me if I'm wrong, are still being massaged as we check all of the different systems. And they're still in that phase. And if you go to the LHS Building Project, you can listen to all the old any old meetings. So if you have a specific interest on how decisions are getting made, go listen to those meetings and then go to the next one.
Yeah, Ricky, no, and actually, Ricky, I'm gonna add a little bit to that
Sure.
actually, because
Mhm.
hi, Adam. He did bring that up with, I happened to be there, and Carolyn Kosnoff, our assistant director of finance for the town. So those kinds of things, like the rebates that we'll be getting back, well, there's the one-time rebates, incentives, right? Chunk of money. There will also be annual chunks of money that we will get back, and it will have to go to the finance committees and be talked about and be decided on. It will have to be a policy, decided on by the town. But very well, some of that stuff could be used to lower the taxpayers' burden on the debt service. So I wouldn't think, again, I'm not the assistant finance, I'm not on the finance committees. I'm not, the one making that decision. But what I understand from what the finance director said, that you could have a choice, or it would be possible to use some of those funds to lower the tax burden on the residents. So not necessarily a rebate, like, money would be taken out and you get it back, but could be an annual relief possibly on taxpayers. So it's definitely, there's lots of options. There's lots of ways that could be used to help relieve the burden on individual homeowners and taxpayers. But it's good that that's being talked about, and it will be talked about more, and that that decision's not going to get made in the next couple of days, because we're a long ways out, but it's important to talk about it.
So I don't know whether any of the slides that either of you showed had the total. There was a question from Stephen W. Is there a rough estimate of the percent of dollars for total construction? And I guess you could use the total construction of 650 million, even though, we're still guesstimating. But did we have a total amount anywhere of federal state incentives? Should all of, when you have a 3% of however much, you have to know the however much to get what the 3% is. But do we have a ballpark of what?
There's been some ballparks put out there by the designer, and it's like basically all of these points, these key design features that are going to create better health, better resiliency, a positive cash flow. It looks like overall it's going to cost less than if you didn't do any of these. Now, how much less?
If we get all of these incentives that we talked about, and it's not guaranteed that we would get all of these incentives, right?
But they're, even
about
that
5%.
Yeah, it's somewhere in that range. It's and again, it depends on, we got to still figure out how many geothermal wells we need, and all of that, but it's looking like it's going to save us money.
Right. And
period.
Let's just say one of those big ones disappears, maybe you're talking about a 2% savings. But
so on every level, when we do this, wherever we come down, we're going to save upfront money costs, period. So whether it's 2% or 5%, this is all going to be worked out over the next amount of time that this continues to go on. I know we're designing.
The important thing about that, sorry, Ricky, the important thing about it is it's looked at in an integrated fashion, right? You're looking at doing all of these things together. Mark said that. I feel like we can't say that enough. I've said it in the beginning, then Mark said it, then I'm saying it again, but it's got to get looked at in an integrated fashion. So you do all of those things together, you maximize the benefits, you maximize the savings, right? So, and to say, well, let's not do that and do that, you're messing up the whole plan. You've got to do it in an integrated fashion. You've got to do it in an iterative fashion to make sure that we're making the best decisions.
Yes, and you keep going through it. So one thing changes, then you have to look back at the whole, so it's the big plan. This is the kind of thing that we're looking to do these days. We're looking ahead. We're looking, we're looking at the big picture. This is not a single thing that's happening. None of the project is happening in a silo. It's all working together.
The simple way to think about it is, remember the question that I get asked at the beginning is, how much is this going to cost me? And the answer is, it's going to save you money up front. It's not, and most people are primed to think it's going to save me money over long term. I hear people say that, but this is a really amazing situation we find ourselves in, that to achieve the outcomes we desire as a community is actually going to lower our upfront cost of building this school. It's not going to cost us anything.
Okay. Was Hastings built to the red list? I mean, what was that in place at the time of Hastings?
We talked about it at Hastings. It wasn't a formal process at Hastings. The police station complied with it completely, and we I think there, out of the 30,000 materials, there was one that there was an exception on in the police station. I think we got to 99.99% or something of that. So the interesting thing about the red list is, as Cindy was saying, back in 2016, when we started talking about it, people were not familiar with this. And there weren't a lot of people asking for this. And so it was one of these situations where people were finding, oh, it would cost more to get a plywood without formaldehyde in it. And what we're finding now is that what the police station experience has taught us is that we didn't pay premiums for non-toxic substances. And for the construction folks, they maybe care even more about, they didn't find materials that they were worried about maintenance. So they only got materials that met the maintenance standards that they had. So they did not have to sacrifice on maintenance, durability, or health. And so this is what's happened is the big construction companies were saying 7 or 8 years ago, we don't know how to do this. And now they're saying, oh, we do know how to do this, and we're doing it all the time.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't you?
And it's actually, again, this is the thing about the integrated design building construction policy being a bit ahead of its time. Part of that, having those requirements to avoid the red list, we're avoiding the red list, we're avoiding the bad things. It's part of a new bonus in the MSBA too, right? Because it's part of air quality. So when you think about air quality, it's not just about great filters and great, air exchanges, getting clean air in, and, low CO2 levels. It's also about all of the paints and carpets and all of the fixtures and everything, the sheetrock, whatever that you have in the building that could be off-gassing, right, and affecting the health of the occupants. So it ties into I agree with Mark. The experience with the police station was really, really great. And finding no cost premiums there, and then getting this extra, this extra back from MSBA.
The one line that I remember from 10 years ago when I first talked to indoor air quality person that came to Lexington, she said, and I just can't forget this, there's no amount of ventilation you can put in a building that will remove the toxic substances you build into the walls.
Okay. Olga, I'm going to ask you to unmute because I know you have a question about batteries that you felt was too long to put into the chat. So let's keep it to the and I would like you to also, yes, I would like you to also explain what you think is adding 175 to 200 square feet dollars.
At some point in some presentation in the million meetings I've attended in the last month about the high school project, somebody put up the slide which showed that the cost of the building, the fields cost this much, this costs that much. And when we wanted to implement all of the green energy items, it costs somewhere between $175 and $200 per square foot initially. My understanding from the way Mark explains it is that, in fact, initially, because we are bonding the whole project and we are not getting anything back until the system function, we actually have to borrow the amount to implement the system. It is in the later years, once the system works, that we will be getting the benefit of the energy reduction or actually the energy credit from the system. Mark, is that correct?
It actually turns out to be better than that, Olga. So it's sort of like when you put a solar energy system on your roof, right? You start from the day it gets interconnected to the grid, you start getting cash flow positive back from it. So
yeah, except for the fact you actually worked with me on our house in 2010, so you know that we have geothermal, we have solar. The only thing we don't have is battery backup. We have a generator.
Right.
And so this is something that I've been following for a long time. And again, you know, when we put on solar panels, we actually had to take a mortgage of however many tens of thousands of dollars
Right.
we had to do. And in paying off the mortgage, we are now benefiting from the yield from the solar panels. But it still means that we had to borrow initially to implement the solar panels. That did not come free. There was nobody who basically said, hey, take the money ahead because you know, we know you're good for it. Which is where the $175 to $200 per square foot of the $1,300 per square foot price came
Right.
from.
So this may be the answer to your question. So exactly what you're talking about is absolutely true. So let's say we need to buy the solar for ourselves, right? And so that's going to cost us, say, $15 million. And that bond is going to create this cash requirement for us to pay the bank back or whoever we're getting the bond from at this rate here. So the very first day we turn the system on, the very first year we turn the system on, we're going to have to pay $750,000 on that bond for that incremental cost of that solar and energy storage system. But we're also in that year going to get solar savings, peak demand savings, and alternative energy credits back at roughly $900,000 more than the debt service. So in the first year, from the first day we move into the building, we will be cash flow positive. It's not something we have to wait for. What you're talking about is a really interesting point, which is 20 years down the line, when you pay off your bond, all of a sudden this is all free. It doesn't have anything you don't have to pay anything after you pay off your 20-year bond.
So again, I think you made my point for me. Let's say that the construction takes 3 years. The system is installed in year 2, middle of the year 2. So there is 1.5 years of when you have bought the system and it hasn't produced anything. And you're already paying for the system because you have it on site, it's been installed, it's part of the project, which I believe, which is why the debt exclusion has to cover the cost of the system. Now, what they will do is they will then figure out how to lower the debt exclusion payments from produced energy. I'm not questioning, somebody asked that question and this was the answer that we were given in some other meetings. I was just reporting it. My question is,
you're absolutely right, Olga. You're absolutely right, Olga. And it's also true for the building, because we're going to have to start building the building and take out a loan to build the building. And
absolutely.
The building will be paying for that for 2 years or 3 years where it's getting built and no students will be in it. So that's just sort of the, yes, you're right.
And unlike residential construction, at least we're not getting much higher interest rate during construction time versus the long-term bond. So, hey, the town has a good deal here.
Yes,
I'm not complaining. I am very excited that the town is doing this. There are two issues that I have. First of all is, you clearly follow this technology much more than I do, but I subscribe to the MIT blurbs, which tell me about all their fancy schmancy research. And recently there was an article about how much battery prices are expected to go down and how much battery technology is, that there is a hope that battery technology will become much more, in a sense, good for the planet. And one of the things they were talking about, hydrogen-based batteries, which were going to have much bigger storage capacity and were much cleaner. And so the question I have is, when we did our system in 2010, we were about 3 years ahead of the technology. And so we did some things wrong that had I now built another house, I know what to fix. The question I have, given how the battery technology is progressing and how bad the current generation of batteries is for the environment, both in terms of how they're produced and how they're disposed of, because batteries have a finite amount of lifespan, would it not be smarter to wait couple of years, set up the connectivity for the batteries that we will eventually install, have all the space, but defer the purchase of the batteries until we get something which is much friendlier to the environment?
Okay, I've got maybe 3 answers to that. So the first answer to that is that we have essentially 5 years from now before we need to install the battery. So the batteries are going to be lower cost and they're going to be newer technologies. And if you follow the battery technology, these lithium and cobalt and whatever are in the process of being replaced by nickel and lots of other things. And so the reason for that is those things are fairly expensive and people are recognizing the environmental concerns. And so they're being replaced at a very rapid rate. At the same time, just in the last year, the cost of batteries has decreased by 50%. So I think you're seeing that the environmental characteristics of the batteries are evolving rapidly. The cost of the batteries are evolving rapidly, as well as the density of the batteries are evolving rapidly. So 5 years from now, we're probably going to have a much smaller battery that is the same capacity from a sort of physical materials perspective. It will need less materials and it will cost less and it'll use less environment. But to your point about deferring, unfortunately, that just doesn't work in this situation. Because remember what I was saying is Eversource has strong limits in terms of what they will allow you, the solar energy system they'll allow you to interconnect. And so they've been fairly lenient about 500 kW and less. We had to spend a couple years talking to them to get Hastings hooked up without some energy storage management of the solar energy. And so I do not believe we will be able to connect our solar to the site without an energy storage battery at the same time. But that's going to be 5 years from now. There's no need to lock in today a technology today. We can do that 5 years from now, and we can interconnect that, a few months before the school's ready to go live.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that. Thank you, Mark. And Olga, thank you for the question and thank you for asking about that, because I am so glad that now that we as new technologies come out, we collectively, right? We're looking at how they might damage people, environment, et cetera. And we're making changes much faster than we did with fossil fuels, right? fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels has done so much damage for so many years, right? And it's taken us so long and done so much damage to try to finally figure out that what's a better way to go. So I'm so glad that you asked that, and that we know that and that we demand, right, to look at what these causes are, what the bad effects of using some of these technologies are, and working right away to make them better. So we've got 5 years, and again, I'm gonna sound like a broken record. It's the iterative process of design, right? You don't have to lock it in now. We're gonna keep looking at that, and there's some couple of really cool people in SMMA. Martine, I'm forgetting her name, but they are all over this. When Mark and I mention these things, she's like, yes, her eyes, get really bright. And so not that we can't, we got to keep with the integrated design policy and make sure that those things happen the right way.
So I'd like to go back to Mark's comments about that we would not be allowed to turn on the solar system. And again, my feeling is I always, particularly with public money, look at everything in terms of cost benefit. And my feeling is we need to assign some value, monetary value, to the environmental damage each battery makes. Okay, this is not just a taxpayer money, because it's also our health. So my feeling is that environmental damage from the products we use has a negative value. If we know that in 2031 there will be a hydrogen battery that has been debugged, and again, I would urge you against not buying something which is, hasn't been tested in the field by somebody else who was fool enough to buy the prototype for at least a year. But if 2031, that hydrogen batteries came out in 2030, by 2031, that they're working, the cost of the environmental damage for each battery that you will buy in 2027, because if the building goes online in 2029, you'll be committing to the technology of 2027. Wouldn't it be smarter to actually pay the high rates to NSTAR, even if we don't use the solar panels, and get better batteries? And again, in my terms, the complete value of the batteries being cheaper than buying something in 2027, which is environmentally harmful. And is anybody doing those computations?
We will be.
And Olga,
But you have to think, we're going to be keeping a close watch of what the technology is evolving to. And this is what Sustainable Lexington is all about, is how do we minimize environmental damage and health benefits? And that is top of the list.
Thank you.
And I'll go back to repeating what Cindy repeated, that Mark repeated, that Cindy repeated, which is, this is, an ongoing process. And this conversation tonight is part of the ongoing process, so we all understand. And I feel confident that the people who know more about this and think about this and read about it day in and day out are on top of it, and will be making decisions along the way that are to the best benefit for the health, cost, economics, and resiliency of a Lexington high school. And I feel very confident, and I hope people here tonight have heard from those who are working on this. Yes, we should all be asking questions. I'm not suggesting we stop asking questions, but this is a very large project on which a lot of energy is being produced, and I thank those people here who are on the SBC and putting in so many hours to the process. But I feel good about the process and about Sustainable Lexington's, eagle eye. Dan Voss, who is on Sustainable Lexington, has been on Sustainable Lexington since day one, as part of the SBC, and he's on top of much of this. There were two questions in the chat that I'm actually not going to answer, but I'm going to give you a reason on why I'm not answering them. Todd, you asked a question about the field house, and because the field house works off the school and how that might affect, the field house is a totally separate subject. I think that's an interesting point. I did not realize the field house is running off the same HVAC system as the high school. So clearly, some decisions will be made, but that's out of scope from tonight's conversation. And the other question was asked, Sally Blyberg, she's no longer here, was to talk about embodied carbon and Reno ad versus complete ad. And that's also a little out of scope for tonight, because that, I encourage people to continue to go to the meetings, because they are choosing a design in November, which is, not far away, as we all know. So let's follow that. We are considering doing a topic on embodied carbon that definitely falls within sustainability. It is a very new concept. We've been talking about it for 3 or 4 years, but that still means it's new. And we're discovering a lot of things, and there's a lot of research being done, and we can bring in some experts to talk about how you put a life cost analysis on whether you tear down an entire building or you leave some of it up. How do you square away the cost of embodied carbon and the cost of new concrete and steel? However, I will say, and Mark and Cindy, if you know more about this, there are lower energy intensive use carbon concrete and steel being made, and that's new. To your point, Olga, let's get a few buildings up using it, and we're not building with it yet, but that is a possibility. So we can lower our embodied carbon costs by using a low emissions concrete and steel. Again, keeping an eye on all the new technologies, what's going to serve us in the future better, but we're not going to discuss that tonight.
Just
but
really
we
quick.
might.
I will say one thing though, which is that the integrated building design policy has a requirement that we report the embodied carbon in the design options that are being considered. So the SMMA design team has already started to do that work. So I haven't seen a lot of information yet, but they've acknowledged it, and we do anticipate being able to weigh, a design option or two on the context of embodied carbon.
Yeah, and I just wanted to totally agree with that. We have started talking about that, and I also wanted to say that HVAC choices and solar and batteries and all of those are independent of whether it's a new building or half, part reno, part ad. So it's like those are still sort of design process and integrated building design process you have to go through anyway, and they apply to whatever, Bricky, like you said, whatever the choice is made for the final building design, location design, all of those things. And then the other thing I wanted to say, people are building with low embodied carbon cement and low embodied carbon steel. It's not like it's hot off the press, right? It's just Lexington hasn't had a project that has used it yet. But it is being used out there. And so we have members of our SBC that have had, experience, members of SBC and the school building committee. We're also members of the permanent building committee who, have some experience with it. So it's quite exciting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you who came tonight, and I especially want to thank Cindy and Mark. You are always available when LexCAN calls for your expertise. We really appreciate that you live in our town and can offer all of this expertise to us when we need it. Again, I suggest people get involved, attend some meetings, educate yourself. If you have opinions on these things, those meetings are the time to have your opinions heard, or write a letter. I don't, there's many ways to communicate with the SBC. And I think you have enough time to do whatever you need to do before you sit down and you're going to watch TV tonight. If it's, so thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you for hosting, Ricky.